Welcome to Dreamy Old Stories. Here we tell slow and gentle tales from history. Stories that calm your mind and help you fall asleep. If you enjoy the journey, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Now, let's begin tonight's dreamy story. Hey guys. Tonight, we're sinking deep, very deep, into one of the least thrilling but strangely satisfying corners of medieval life. So dim the lights. Get comfortable. Maybe make yourself a cup of something warm that vaguely tastes like history, like chamomile tea. Or maybe that suspicious barley drink your friends swore was authentic. Because tonight, we're talking about grain storage. Yes, grain storage. The quiet, dusty backbone of the Middle Ages, while kings were stabbing each other over land and crowns, and peasants were breaking their spines in muddy fields. The real action, if we can call it that, was happening in barns. Let's float into one of those barns now. It's the 13th century. Somewhere in England, maybe not far from a monastery that smells faintly of damp parchment and regret. A wooden barn looms at the edge of a field. The air inside is thick with dust, mouse droppings, and the general sense that no one has swept in about, say, forever. Grain was life. It was currency, food, and social stability all rolled into one sack of itchy misery. Without it, everyone starved, including the monks, the lords, and the guy who insisted his title was keeper of the granary, which sounds impressive, until you realize he mostly just watched piles of wheat. The storage of grain wasn't just about tossing it into a corner and hoping for the best. Oh no. The medieval mind was practical, paranoid, and slightly obsessed with rot. If your barley went bad, it wasn't just an inconvenience. It was basically economic apocalypse. So they built barns, huge echoing structures made of oak and thatch. Some were grand enough to look like small cathedrals, because nothing says we take our wheat seriously like Gothic arches for your oats. Of course, not all barns were equal. Peasants had their small, crooked versions. Think of something that looked like it would collapse if you sneezed near it, while monasteries built monumental granaries that could swallow a small village whole. Let's pause and picture one. The great barn of Cressing Temple, built by the Knights Templar in the 13th century. Because of course, the Templars, famous for crusades and secret treasures, also needed somewhere to keep their barley. It's still standing today, a testament to just how enduringly boring yet efficient medieval architecture could be. Inside, the design was simple: raised floors, ventilation gaps, and sometimes even stone bases to keep the grain off the damp ground. Rats were the eternal enemy. You can almost hear the quiet scurrying in the corners, the little squeaks of rodents who were, frankly, just trying to eat their way into the aristocracy to deal with them. People set traps, kept cats, or in some cases, performed rat trials. Yes, actual legal proceedings. Medieval courts would summon the rats, literally summon them, to appear and face charges for grain theft. Predictably, the rats never showed. Shocking. Let's just take a slow moment to appreciate that somewhere. In a dusty courtroom, a man in a robe once said, "The rats have been summoned, Your Honor," and then paused for dramatic effect while the entire village waited for the accused to appear. But back to barns. You see, storing grain was less about innovation and more about survival panic. The moment harvest ended, everyone suddenly became an amateur meteorologist. Too much humidity, the grain would sprout. To dry, it would crumble. Too much rat, well, that's self-explanatory. In large estates, grain storage was managed by a reeve or a bailiff. The reeve was basically the local micromanager who counted every sheaf like it was his personal retirement fund. Monks, on the other hand, approached it with spiritual zeal. They recorded harvests in ledgers that read like the world's dullest diary entries. Today we stored 9 bushels of barley. Brother Thomas sneezed on 2. There's something oddly soothing about the rhythm of medieval record-keeping. It's meticulous. It's slow. It's the kind of thing you can almost fall asleep to, which is, frankly, the entire point of this narration. Now, barns weren't just for storage. They were a kind of social symbol. If your barn was big, you were important. It was the medieval version of having an oversized garage. Lords showed off their grain capacity like some people show off cars. Oh, you only store 30 bushels? Cute. Let's float over to France, where barns were called granges. Many of these were owned by monasteries that functioned more like corporations than places of worship. The monks of Cluny, for example, had a network of granges that stretched across Europe. Each one a quiet little empire of barley. Grain moved like money, collected as tithes, shipped off to markets, or sold to buy luxuries like candles, books, and occasionally more monasteries. When famine hit, grain barns turned into political weapons. Lords could either open them to feed the people, or lock them up and pretend the peasants had simply forgotten to pray harder. It was a delicate balance between generosity, greed, and a general misunderstanding of how mold works. And speaking of mold, storage conditions mattered. Ventilation was everything. Medieval builders knew enough about airflow to design barns with gaps between planks, open gables, and sometimes even wind tunnels. They didn't call it climate control, but that's essentially what it was. Still, things went wrong. Grain sweated. Yes, that was the term. Sweating grain meant moisture buildup, a slow, sticky death spiral that turned your wheat into compost. Once that happened, the entire crop could be lost. Imagine the silence in a manor house when someone discovered that the entire winter's grain supply had gone bad. No shouting, no drama, just a slow, collective realization that everyone would now be eating turnips until spring. Let's take another slow drift, this time toward the human side. Peasants rarely had enough grain to store for long. Most of what they harvested went straight into taxes, tithes, or bread. Their barns were small and often shared with animals. So yes, your grain might spend the winter in the company of your cow. The air must have been fragrant, and yet, somehow, it worked. In a world without modern science, they learned through centuries of painful trial and error, mostly error, how to keep their grain dry, cool, and edible. They piled it carefully, layered it with straw, sometimes even spread salt or ashes to ward off insects. Practical magic, in a sense. The rich, of course, had fancier systems. Some even built stone granaries with sloped floors so they could sweep out the grain easily. These were the ancient ancestors of your modern grain silos, just with more bats. And speaking of bats, they weren't the worst roommates to have. Bats ate insects, and insects were a nightmare. Weevils, beetles, and moth larvae could destroy entire stores. So while bats hung from rafters like tiny night janitors, they were silently doing God's work. Now, if you were particularly unlucky, your barn might catch fire. Dry grain was like tinder, and one careless lantern could turn your livelihood into a medieval bonfire. Some chroniclers note entire villages burning because someone decided to check their oats at night with a candle. There were no insurance claims for that. Just the quiet sound of your neighbors sighing and rebuilding everything out of the same flammable material. Let's stay here a moment, in this strange, dusty stillness of the medieval barn. The smell of hay, grain, wood, and maybe just a hint of rat. The rhythmic creak of beams, the faint whistle of wind through the planks. Everything heavy, slow, and grounded in a world obsessed with war, conquest, and divine destiny. The barn was the quiet center of survival. It wasn't glorious. It wasn't heroic, but it was essential. Every feast, every loaf, every beer brewed in a monastery cellar, it all began here, in the patient silence of stored grain. And maybe that's the secret charm of medieval barns. They were boring, magnificently, beautifully boring. Now, picture an early morning in late autumn, the kind of morning that feels like it hasn't quite decided whether to freeze or drizzle. A thin mist hugs the thatched roofs, and the air smells faintly of earth, smoke, and something vaguely edible, probably porridge. The harvest is done. The fields are empty except for the tired ghosts of wheat stalks waving in the wind. And across the village, wagons creak under the weight of grain sacks being hauled toward the barns. You can almost hear the sound. Wooden wheels on muddy paths, the low grumble of oxen, the occasional curse when a sack slips. There's no rush. Nobody in the Middle Ages rushed unless they were being chased by something with a sword. Each load of grain represents months of sweat and prayer. It also represents taxes, because before the grain could become bread, a portion of it would vanish, taken by the Lord, the Church, and anyone else with a claim to divine rights and storage fees. Taxes were rarely paid in coins. They were paid in grain, cheese, eggs, basically whatever could be counted and hoarded. The barn, therefore, wasn't just a food store. It was a medieval bank vault. A vault without guards, but with a lot of hay. And so, we find ourselves back inside. It's dim, but sunlight slips through the cracks like golden threads, lighting up the dust. Somewhere in the rafters, a pigeon coos, or maybe it's judging you. Hard to tell with pigeons. Stacks of sacks rise up along the walls, carefully arranged by someone who definitely didn't get paid enough for the job. The reeve is there, counting each one in a voice that sounds perpetually tired. He doesn't trust anyone. Not the peasants, not the weather, and certainly not the rats. Because the thing about medieval grain storage is that everything wanted to eat it. Humans, animals, insects, even mold. It was a buffet for the entire ecosystem, which meant constant vigilance, or at least as much vigilance as you could muster after hauling barley all day. So people invented little tricks. They laid straw between layers of grain to absorb moisture. They sprinkled herbs like mint or tansy to discourage pests. They placed cats inside barns, though cats being cats, half the time they just slept on the sacks and watched the mice go by. Some barns even had special raised platforms called granary stilts. These kept the grain off the ground and out of reach of dampness, and also, theoretically, rats. Though the rats usually took that as a challenge. Now, let's talk about the smell. Medieval barns had a very particular scent, a mix of dry hay, wood smoke, and fermentation. If you stood there long enough, you could probably tell the difference between barley and wheat by smell alone. Or maybe you just got used to it and accepted your nose was broken. Monks, especially, took pride in their storage. A monastery's granary was like its stomach, and monks, being both practical and deeply food motivated, treated it with care. Records from abbeys across England show meticulous entries about grain levels. Every bushel counted, every loss noted, sometimes even with suspicious precision. You'll see things like 2 measures lost to vermin, 3 measures given to the poor, half a measure consumed by Brother John's accidental fire. Accidental? Sure, John. It's worth noting that monasteries often lent grain out to local farmers during bad seasons, expecting repayment later, with interest, of course. So yes, the monks were basically the medieval version of a rural loan office, only with more chanting. Let's drift to another scene, a noble estate. Here, barns were architectural statements. Massive timber frames, stone walls, and decorative carvings on the doors. Because nothing says I'm wealthy quite like a hand-carved oak beam supporting your barley. Inside, servants would labor under strict orders not to mess up the stacks. The steward might pace with a wax tablet, noting every movement. He wasn't paranoid, just fully aware that one missing sack could mean a few less loaves of bread, or worse, a suspicious visit from the tax collector. And the tax collector always came, usually smiling, always unwanted. In France, these taxes were part of what was called the taille, a lovely system that made sure peasants never quite had enough to rest easy. In England, it was tithes to the church and dues to the manor. The barns were the collection points. You brought your grain, laid it out, and hoped the Lord's men didn't accidentally take more than their share. Grain itself was a kind of medieval celebrity. It was weighed, measured, blessed, cursed, and endlessly discussed. Entire calendars revolved around its growth, planting, harvesting, threshing, storing, and finally, baking. Each stage had rituals and superstitions. Before harvest, people might bless the fields. After harvest, they might leave a few sheaves standing, offerings to the spirits who, presumably, liked snacks. Even the barn had its own small traditions. In some regions, the first sack placed inside was marked with a cross or sprinkled with holy water, because even God needed to supervise the barley sometimes. But not everything about grain storage was sacred. Sometimes it was scandalous. There were stories, whispered, of course, of barns being raided at night, desperate peasants slipping in to steal handfuls of wheat, knowing full well the punishment could be brutal. But hunger doesn't care about feudal law. Some lords even accused their own stewards of borrowing grain. That word again, borrowing. It was the medieval term for I took it and hope no one notices. Still, for all the fear and politics, there's something deeply calming about the image of a medieval barn at rest. Evening falls. The sun slants low across the fields, turning everything gold. A few last birds flutter through the open door, chasing flies. The air cools, the smell of grain deepens, and somewhere outside, the faint sound of a bell signals vespers. Inside, it's silent except for the occasional rustle. Maybe a mouse, maybe the shifting weight of the grain itself, tiny movements that make soft, whispering sounds, the kind of sound that fills the silence but doesn't disturb it. It's easy to forget that these barns held not just food, but stories. Every harvest year had its drama, good weather, bad weather, lost sacks, miraculous saves. Generations worked in the same space, stacking grain where their parents had stacked it, fixing the same beams, fighting the same rats. The barns became part of family memory, a place of continuity in a world that changed slowly, if at all, and over time, as centuries passed. Some of these barns simply stayed standing. Long after the people were gone, If you visit old English villages today, you can still find them, converted into homes, tea rooms, or museums. The beams are blackened with age, but they hold firm. You can almost feel the echo of medieval life, the faint sound of sacks being dragged, the steady rhythm of counting, the quiet pride of a well-stocked harvest. Of course, most of the original grain is long gone, probably eaten, lost, or turned into very old dust. But the barns remain, silent reminders that survival wasn't about knights or kings. It was about keeping wheat dry through the winter. And somehow that's comforting. Got it? We'll keep drifting. Same sleepy tone, same calm pace, same slightly amused look at people who took their wheat way too seriously. Let's linger a little longer in that evening light. The barn door is cracked open, just enough to let in the smell of the fields. The harvest is over. The carts are empty. Everyone's gone home, except for the cats, and maybe one tired reeve who insists on counting just one more sack before bed. He's not doing it because anyone asked him to. He's doing it because he doesn't trust anyone, and because once, 10 years ago, a few sacks mysteriously went missing, and he's still not over it. This was the quiet anxiety of medieval life. You could lose everything to weather, war, or worms. So you watched your grain like it was gold, because, in many ways, it was. Let's zoom out a bit. The entire medieval economy, all those kings, crusades, and castles rested on grain. It fed armies, supported monasteries, and paid taxes. Without it, the system collapsed. A barn, then, wasn't just a building. It was a safeguard against chaos. Every lord, abbot, and peasant knew that when the grain failed, things got ugly fast. Prices spiked, bread vanished, and neighbors started eyeing each other's granaries a little too closely. The line between a peaceful village and a riot was often just a few bad harvests. That's why storage wasn't simply practical. It was political. Controlling grain meant controlling people. If you could feed them, they obeyed. If you couldn't, well, they tended to stop listening. Lords understood this. So did kings. So did the church, which often encouraged tithes in grain rather than money, because bread was power. In some years, the barns of abbeys were so full that they had to build extensions, not because they wanted more bread, but because it was safer to keep it than risk moving it across dangerous roads patrolled by bandits, who apparently loved barley as much as everyone else. Transportation was its own headache. Grain was heavy, bulky, and slow to move. Carts creaked, oxen groaned, and half the time, rain turned the roads into swamps. So most of it stayed local. Each manor stored its own, keeping just enough surplus for trade or emergencies. That's where things got tricky. Let's imagine a cold winter. Maybe around 1316. The harvest had been poor. The rains came early. The barns smell faintly sour. You open a sack and see sprouted kernels, useless. The reeve looks at it and says nothing, because what's there to say? That year, many didn't make it. Across Europe, bad weather ruined crops for 3 straight seasons. The Great Famine, they called it later, though at the time, it probably just felt like one long, miserable mistake. People ground up acorns, bark, even weeds to mix with what little grain they had left. Bread turned grey and bitter, and in some villages, when the barns were finally empty, the silence must have been unbearable. It's strange to think of famine in such quiet terms. Not chaos or riots, just slow, patient hunger. The barns stood empty like hollow ribs, waiting for a harvest that never quite arrived. But the thing about medieval people is, they were stubborn. They kept rebuilding, reseeding, and restacking. Every spring was a gamble, and every autumn a cautious victory. So when a barn was full, it was cause for celebration. Not loud, joyful celebration, but that deep, collective sigh of relief that says, "We made it. Now, let's drift toward trade." Even in the slow medieval world, grain moved by river, road, and ship. It was sold in markets, measured in bushels, taxed again, and stored all over again in merchant granaries. These were the cousins of our quiet rural barns, just noisier, costlier, and filled with dockhands instead of monks. Cities like London, Bruges, and Venice had massive storage systems. Stone warehouses lined the ports, and inspectors checked for moisture and rot. They even had grain brokers, which sounds oddly modern. These men made fortunes by predicting shortages and buying low, selling high, usually to the same peasants who'd grown it in the first place. Meanwhile, back in the countryside, most people never saw that money. Their barns were insurance policies they couldn't cash out. You ate what you stored, and if you stored poorly, you paid the price. And let's be honest, sometimes you didn't even get to eat what you stored, because there was always the Lord's share, the little reminder that none of it truly belonged to you. The church's tenth, the miller's fee, the baker's cut. By the time everyone had taken their portion, the family might be left with barely enough to last until spring. Still, they stored it carefully, a layer of straw, a prayer whispered under the breath, a quick glance at the roof beams to make sure they weren't leaking again. It's almost meditative, this quiet ritual of maintenance. You can imagine an old farmer, maybe 60, bent and stiff from years of plowing, standing inside his barn one last time before winter. He runs a hand over the sacks, listens to the faint rustle of grain settling. He knows he won't live forever, but for now, the barn is full, and that's enough. He locks the door. The air outside bites at his cheeks. Somewhere nearby, smoke rises from the hearth. Dinner tonight will be simple: bread, maybe a bit of cheese if the cow's been generous. He doesn't need more. The grain will sleep until spring, and so will he. The beauty of medieval barns lies in that rhythm. The cycle of storing, waiting, consuming, and rebuilding. It's the quiet backbone of centuries. Every cathedral was built on full stomachs. Every crusade marched on bread. Every royal feast began in the same kind of dusty, drafty barn we've been wandering through tonight. And maybe that's the irony. For all the talk of kings and knights, it was really the grain that ruled. Without it, the castles crumble, the churches starve, the armies disband. But with it, the world keeps turning, slowly, stubbornly, like a millstone grinding on and on. So next time you see an old barn, half collapsed in a field, just standing there like a tired ghost, remember, that's history's heartbeat. Not in the crowns or the wars, but in the dry whisper of stored wheat under a timber roof. And that's where we'll leave it for now, in the soft, dusty stillness of medieval survival. Tonight, we're going to float into the next layer of this sleepy saga, the people behind the barns. The men in robes, rings, and ridiculous titles who realized, very early on, that whoever controlled the bread controlled everything else. Because let's face it, the medieval world wasn't run by swords. It was run by sacks. The church. God's grain managers, let's start with the church. Because of course we do. If you thought monks were just busy praying and copying books, think again. A good number of them were up to their elbows in grain accounts, and many abbots could give modern CEOs a run for their money in terms of micromanagement. The church didn't just collect tithes, they stored them obsessively. Every 10th sheaf from every field, carefully measured and brought into their barns. Those barns, by the way, weren't your humble peasant sheds. They were vast, echoing halls of oak and stone. Some still stand today. Cotswold granges, English tithe barns, places where the air still smells faintly of dust and eternity. Monks called grain fromentum, which sounds fancy, but it just meant stuff that becomes bread. They catalogued it with precision that bordered on mania. 4 bushels from Brother Robert's plot, 2 from the lower meadow, 1 from the field that floods, but we still plant there anyway, because hope springs eternal. And they didn't hoard it just for fun. The church used grain like currency. They loaned it to peasants in bad years and demanded repayment, often in more grain, sometimes with interest, though no one used that word out loud because, technically, charging interest was a sin, but they found loopholes. Medieval religion was basically a masterclass in creative loopholes, so instead of interest, they called it a generous return. Instead of debt, they called it grateful obligation. It sounds holy. Until you realize the monks were running a full-scale agrarian banking system out of their barns. And of course, if famine hit, the church's barns became lifelines or tools of control. They could feed the poor, and they often did, but always with ceremony. Bread was handed out under the watchful eye of the abbot, usually after a small reminder about the importance of obedience, charity, and not questioning why the monastery had 10 times more grain than everyone else. It was benevolence with conditions. The peasants knew it. The monks knew it. Everyone smiled politely and took the bread anyway. The lords of the land now let shift to the secular side. The landowners, nobles, and minor tyrants who treated barns like personal trophies. A lord's wealth wasn't measured in coins. It was measured in grain, specifically how long he could keep his household fed without asking anyone for help. If you could last through a bad harvest or two, you were powerful. If you couldn't, your neighbors noticed, and not in a good way. Medieval politics was basically one long game of who still has wheat. So lords built their own granaries, usually big, intimidating structures inside the manor complex. The barns themselves weren't glamorous, but they were essential. A noble without a barn was like a knight without armor, vulnerable, broke, and probably about to marry someone for dowry grain. Yes, that was a thing. Marriages arranged partly to secure harvests. Love might be blind, but it definitely had opinions about barley yields. Lords often hoarded more grain than they could possibly eat, because in medieval logic, abundance equaled safety. There was no concept of excess inventory. If the barn was full, build another. If the peasants complained about hunger, remind them that God loves patience. Of course, barns could also serve as leverage. A lord with surplus grain could lend it to his neighbors, forging alliances, or quietly ruin them by charging storage fees. It was early capitalism, just without the spreadsheets. There's something grimly fascinating about it. Everyone depended on everyone else's barns, but no one trusted anyone. You could almost hear it in conversation. Good harvest this year, my lord. Yes, indeed. You're still short 3 sacks from last year. By the way, medieval small talk was just disguised accounting. The peasants' half barns At the bottom of this grain pyramid, the peasants were doing what they always did, trying to survive without breaking feudal law or their backs. Their barns were small, sometimes barely barns at all, a lean-to with a roof, a corner of the house, maybe a communal shed shared by half the village. They stored what little grain they could after paying taxes and tithes. Some used clay pots, baskets, or shallow pits lined with straw, risky but better than nothing. These underground granaries were called silos, though they looked more like panic holes. The peasants' relationship with grain was simple: keep enough to live, surrender the rest. It wasn't about wealth. It was about survival math. If a rat chewed through your sack, you didn't just lose food. You lost your next meal, maybe your seed for planting, which meant you were borrowing from the monastery, which meant you were in debt, which meant you'd spend next harvest working someone else's field. Grain was both salvation and trap. Still, peasants were ingenious. They found local tricks to keep it safe, mixing ashes with the kernels, sealing openings with mud, even singing short blessings over the sacks because, really, you couldn't be too careful when it came to divine rodent management. Some villages even had shared grain stores, early versions of community banks. Everyone contributed a portion of the harvest, and in bad years, families could borrow from it. A small flicker of solidarity in a world that rarely rewarded it. Of course, there were scandals because nothing involving humans stays pure for long. There were accusations of monks watering down grain shipments, lords secretly exporting their stores during famine, and millers accidentally keeping a little too much flour for themselves. Millers, by the way, were the middlemen of the grain world, the most distrusted men in the village. Every time grain disappeared mysteriously, everyone looked straight at the mill. One English proverb even said, "Every miller hath a thumb of gold," which is a poetic way of saying, he's stealing and we all know it. But stealing grain wasn't just greed. Sometimes it was survival. The line between theft and necessity blurred fast when your children were hungry. Lords could hoard without shame. Peasants had to risk their lives for a handful of barley. That quiet unfairness hums under every page of medieval history. You can hear it in the ledgers, the sermons, the court rolls, the endless balancing act between hunger and punishment. Barns as symbols, it's strange, but barns became symbols of power. You could read a lord's prestige in the size of his grain store. Monasteries flaunted theirs as proof of divine favor. Even towns bragged about their municipal granaries, as if good ventilation were a moral achievement. Architecturally, they evolved. Early barns were crude, rough timber and mud walls. Later, they grew grand, with carved beams and tiled roofs. Some were so ornate that they looked like churches from the outside, which is funny, considering both were dedicated to saving souls, one spiritual, the other nutritional, and if you ever visit one of those surviving Tithe barns, you can feel it. The hush inside, the cool air, the sense that this building was made for patience, not excitement. It was built to wait, for months, for years, for whatever came next. That's the heart of medieval life right there. Endurance disguised as architecture. As night settles in, you can imagine all those barns across Europe, sleeping under the stars. Quiet, heavy, and full of potential. Somewhere, a monk's candle burns low as he tallies the last of the harvest numbers. A lord locks his granary door, feeling smug. A peasant counts his sacks, sighs, and says a prayer to both God and the local cat. Different lives. sane dependence, and outside, the wind moves through the fields, flattening the stubble of the last harvest. The earth rests. The barns breathe in silence. Tomorrow, someone will check the grain again, because they always did. Now, one of the strangest things about medieval grain storage was how spiritual people got about it. You'd think it was just about keeping wheat dry, but no. There were prayers, blessings, even minor exorcisms. Priests would sprinkle holy water over full granaries, partly to protect them from pests, and partly, just in case demons were behind the weevil infestations. Because in the Middle Ages, if something went wrong, chances were good the devil had a hand in it. Farmers believed rats were servants of Satan, which is funny, because in many cases, they were just hungry rodents, doing what rodents do, eating. But that didn't stop people from building rat crosses outside barns, little wooden crosses stuck into the earth to keep the vermin morally discouraged. Spoiler, they weren't grain. By the way, wasn't just dumped in a pile and forgotten. Oh no, there was a system, sort of. It usually went like this. Pour the grain into a corner, trample it down, then smooth it over with a spade. Some barns used wooden bins, others had pits lined with straw and clay. The straw helped absorb moisture, which was great, except when it wasn't, because damp straw could heat up and spontaneously combust. Imagine explaining to your feudal lord that his winters, bread just went up in smoke because the hay caught fire. Speaking of lords, they had their own version of a grain manager, usually some overworked steward or bailiff who took inventory. An inventory meant counting sacks, every single one. If any went missing, the steward was held responsible, often fined or publicly humiliated. You didn't want to be the guy caught short of 10 bushels. That could cost you more than your job. Let's float over to a monastery barn now. Much neater, better built, less rat problem. Monks took grain storage seriously because they had the resources and the patience. A typical monastic barn was a beauty of medieval engineering. Tall stone walls, high-pitched roofs, ventilation slits, and elaborate wooden trusses. These things looked like cathedrals for wheat. They also had rules. The rule of Saint Benedict didn't directly mention don't waste grain, but the spirit of thriftiness ran deep. Monks measured, recorded, sealed, and checked their stores obsessively. They even had specialized tools, like long-handled scoops and balance scales. When peasants came to deliver their tithe, a tenth of their crop, the monks measured it out carefully. And heaven helped the farmer who tried to cheat with damp grain. And yet, even the monasteries had their mishaps. In 1298, a Benedictine barn in France collapsed under its own weight. Too much barley, not enough architectural foresight. Imagine that, a literal mountain of grain spilling out like a biblical sand dune, covering carts and chickens alike. The chronicles noted it dryly. The Lord's bounty exceeded the strength of our beams, which is a poetic way of saying we overpacked the barn. Let's wander back to the countryside for a moment. Picture a small village somewhere in Yorkshire or Normandy. The harvest's done, the carts are creaking, and everyone's rushing to store the grain before the rains. You'd see men stomping down the barley with bare feet, women spreading layers of straw, and kids chasing away chickens who thought they'd found heaven. Every handful of grain mattered, not just for bread, but for taxes, rent, and survival. If your lord came collecting and your barn looked suspiciously empty, he'd assume you were hiding grain somewhere else. And honestly, people often were. Hidden pits were a thing. shallow holes in the ground, lined with straw and sealed with clay. Basically medieval Tupperware. Not perfect, but sometimes better than handing everything over to the manor, of course. Sometimes people forgot where they buried it, which led to a common sight centuries later. Farmers digging up ancient lumps of mummified wheat by the way. Grain didn't always mean just wheat or barley. In some regions, oats and rye were the real stars. Wheat was a luxury. Barley made your ale, rye made your bread, and oats fed your animals, and occasionally you. The type of grain stored in a barn said a lot about who you were. A nobleman's store smelled like fine wheat and polished tools. A peasant's smelled like mixed barley, mouse droppings, and hope. Storage methods reflected that class divide. Wealthy estates sometimes had grain dryers, clever stone chambers with a fire pit beneath. Warm air rose through the floor, drying the grain evenly. Peasants had, well, they had patience and luck. If it rained, they prayed. Now, let's talk about pests again, because they were basically the medieval end boss. Mice, rats, weevils, beetles, and moths, all eager to turn your livelihood into dust. People tried everything. Cats were the classic choice, of course, but cats were also seen as witchy, so it was a bit of a moral gamble. Do you want your grain safe or your soul safe? Other pest deterrents included hanging bunches of herbs, sage, lavender, sometimes even garlic, believed to repel insects. Some barns had cats and a resident owl, the perfect pest control duo, until, inevitably, the owl ate the cat's kitten and caused a minor village feud by the 14th century. Things got a bit more sophisticated. Lords started using granaries, separate from barns, elevated on stone piers, kind of like big pigeon lofts for grain. The idea was simple: air circulation below, fewer rats climbing in. It worked, mostly. The design spread across Europe, especially in wetter regions like England and Flanders. But nothing lasted forever. Grain still spoiled. And when it did, people didn't waste it. Spoiled grain might be turned into animal feed or, in truly desperate times, boiled and eaten anyway. Which explains a lot about medieval digestion. Let's drift for a moment into the psychology of it all. Imagine living your whole life knowing that the pile of wheat in the barn determined whether you'd live through winter. Every creak of the roof, every rustle in the dark, it mattered. Grain wasn't just food. It was security, currency, and power. It's why wars were fought over fields, not gold. Even the church used grain as leverage. A sinner could pay for absolution in sacks of wheat. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. Here's 2 bushels of rye." Not a bad deal if you think about it. As time passed, people developed seasonal rhythms around their storage habits. Grain was inspected during Advent, aired in spring, and checked again after the summer rains. They even held festivals, like Lammas Day, marking the first loaves baked from the new harvest. The barns were decorated, and the community gathered to thank the saints for not letting everything rot. You can almost hear it, can't you? The creak of the doors, the rustle of straw, the slow drip of rain outside. Everyone hoping the walls hold, the grain stays dry, and the year doesn't betray them. Let's float to another region, maybe down into Italy, where things were warmer and, as always, a bit more dramatic. Italian granaries often used clay jars, sealed and buried, called doli. These could hold hundreds of liters of grain and kept it surprisingly fresh. Archaeologists still find them intact, with remnants of ancient wheat inside, proof that some ideas actually worked. Meanwhile, in Northern Europe, the cold was both enemy and ally. It slowed spoilage, but made drying grain harder. People learned to use smokehouses, hanging grain bags above low fires to chase out moisture. It gave the bread a faint smoky flavor, which sounds fancy now, but back then probably tasted like desperation and ashes. And so the cycle went on, year after year, century after century. Harvest, thresh, store, pray. Grain was never just a crop. It was a fragile promise, tucked under a thatched roof, guarded by superstition and sweat. We'll linger here for a while longer, surrounded by the quiet hum of the medieval countryside. Because this isn't just about barns, it's about patience, anxiety, and the slow, humble rhythm that kept the world turning before machines took over. Let's rest here for a moment. The air smells faintly of straw and candle wax. The rats have gone quiet. Outside, the moonlight slides across the field. Tomorrow, someone will open those barn doors again, and the cycle will begin anew. Grain wasn't just a crop. It was the measure of everything. Taxes, power, survival, even morality. When someone said a person was worth 10 sacks of wheat, they meant it literally. Because 10 sacks could feed a family, pay a priest, or buy a year of forgiveness, depending on who you asked. Now, you might think the peasants worked the hardest here, and you'd be right. But they didn't actually own much of the grain they harvested. After weeks of threshing, drying, and hauling, a good portion went straight to the Lord's storehouse. Then another chunk went to the church. By the time a family got to keep what was theirs, they were already thinking about next year's seed and realizing they barely had enough for bread. It wasn't theft, exactly, just feudal efficiency. The system had a rhythm. After the harvest, barns were inspected. Grain was measured using wooden bushels or big stone troughs. The steward would stand nearby, probably bored and slightly smug, while a clerk scratched numbers into a wax tablet. Then came the tallying. What went to the manor, what went to the priest, and what little stayed in the village. This was called the tithe. 10% for God. Though, of course, it wasn't God who came to collect it. It was the local priest, or a monk with a cart and 2 unhappy oxen. And he'd make sure to remind you that generosity was a virtue, especially generosity toward the church. Sometimes, though, people forgot to pay. Not in open rebellion, just quietly. Maybe a few sacks went missing between the field and the barn. Maybe a rat hole got a little too big. Maybe no one noticed that the pile seemed slightly shorter this year. The steward always noticed, of course, but proving it was another matter. Let's drift a bit into how that grain was guarded, because nothing attracted trouble like a full barn. Stealing grain was a serious crime, not because it was glamorous, but because it was personal. If you stole a man's grain, you weren't just robbing him. You were threatening his survival. That's why barns were often locked, chained, or even watched overnight. A few villagers took turns, a kind of medieval night watch. Picture a tired farmer sitting by the door with a lantern, poking the fire every now and then, trying not to fall asleep while mice scurried in the dark. But sometimes, even that wasn't enough. There are records from 14th century England of organized grain theft. Whole gangs breaking into barns, hauling off sacks and selling them at distant markets. Basically the medieval version of grand larceny, but slower and itchier, and when they got caught, it didn't end well. Public shaming was the usual punishment. being tied to a post near the granary you robbed, so everyone could throw handfuls of chaff at you, which doesn't sound that bad, until you remember chaff is sharp and humiliating. The church had its own way of protecting its stores. Monks liked to carve blessings into the wooden doors of barns, little Latin phrases asking for divine protection against fire, rot, and mice of the devil. Some even hung crosses made from the first sheaf of the harvest, called the corn dolly. It was meant to hold the spirit of the grain, keeping the rest fertile for next year. Now, whether that actually worked is debatable, but the ritual itself mattered more than the result. It was a way to turn anxiety into ceremony. You can't control the weather or the weevils, but you can carve a prayer into a door and hope it sticks. Let's pause on the smell for a second, because it really tells you everything about the place. Barns had their own perfume: dry husk, cold air, a hint of smoke from the hearth next door, and underneath it all, that faint sweetness of life stored away. People didn't talk about it much, but the smell of grain was comforting. It meant survival. You could close your eyes, take a deep breath, and think, we made it through another year. And in a world where everything depended on weather, that was no small thing. The way people handled grain also told you about their technology, or lack of it. There were no thermometers, no moisture meters, no precision tools. Just touch, smell, and experience. The good farmers could tell if grain was too damp just by the sound of it falling into a bin. If it clumped instead of flowing, it meant trouble. They'd spread it out, rake it, wait for the right breeze. It was slow work, but they had time. Winter was long, and boredom was a luxury. So they'd sit there, staring at a pile of barley, occasionally stirring it, talking about saints or taxes, or how the weather ruined the oats again. It was a simple rhythm, not easy, but familiar now. About the barns themselves, they weren't all the same. In Northern Europe, the big timber-framed ones could last for centuries. Thick oak beams, thatched roofs, and walls packed with wattle and daub. In warmer areas, stone barns were more common. Cooler, sturdier, less flammable. Some were even designed with double doors, perfectly aligned, so wind could blow straight through and dry the grain naturally. It's easy to underestimate how clever that was. Medieval builders didn't have blueprints. They had intuition, trial, and a few centuries of mistakes. The barns that survived were the ones built by people who knew exactly how high humidity climbed in July. Let's float over to Scandinavia for a moment. There, barns took a slightly different approach. Because of the cold, people built smaller, elevated granaries on stilts, little wooden houses, like tiny castles for oats. You climbed up by ladder, lifted a hatch, and scooped out what you needed. The idea was simple. Mice can't climb smooth poles. Spoiler, they learned to, but the design caught on anyway, mostly because it looked tidy and worked just well enough. Some of these granaries still exist, tucked in valleys, weathered grey, still holding the smell of old rye and pine in the southern regions. Spain, Italy, parts of southern France. It was all about heat management. Too much warmth, and your grain baked itself into a rock. Too little, and it molded. People learned to use ventilation tunnels, clay floors, and, in a few rare cases, even underground silos. These were deep pits lined with plaster or stone, sealed at the top with a wooden lid. Once filled, the oxygen level dropped, which killed off insects. Accidental medieval science. It worked remarkably well, though no one fully understood why. They just knew, if we seal it, it lasts longer. It's the same kind of logic behind not asking why bread rises, just being glad it does. Let's step back into England again, because English chroniclers loved complaining about grain. It was practically a national pastime. Bad harvests were recorded like personal insults. The Lord, in his wisdom, sent a dampness that spoiled all the barley. Translation: it rained again. During those bad years, barns became symbols of luck and envy. A full barn meant stability. An empty one meant desperation. Some people even gave them names, like St. Anne's Store or the Good Keeper, which is oddly touching, like naming a pet rock that might save your life by the 15th century. Trade had changed things. Grain wasn't just stored for survival anymore, it was also a commodity. Ports like Bruges, Lubeck, and London had entire warehouses dedicated to storing imported grain. These were massive structures, with pulley systems and guarded doors, but the soul of storage still stayed in the countryside. In those small, quiet barns with their crooked beams and uneven floors, the places where families whispered prayers over their harvest, where children learned to tell good wheat from bad by touch, and where old men sat by the door, pretending to guard the grain but mostly just watching the sunset. There's something quietly beautiful about that, isn't there? A civilization depending on a humble pile of seeds. No glory, no grandeur, just the soft rustle of stored life waiting to be reborn next spring. So, let's stay here a little longer in that slow rhythm, with the wind slipping through the gaps in the wood. Tomorrow will come, and someone will open these doors again. They'll scoop a little grain into a basket, feed the animals, grind some flour, or count what's left. Life will go on as it did for centuries, in barns just like this one. Let's start with taxes, because if there's one universal truth in history, it's that somebody, somewhere, always wants a share of your wheat. In medieval Europe, grain wasn't just food. It was the standard currency. Gold was nice, but bread kept people alive. So the kings, lords, and churches all agreed, if you grew it, they'd take it. Fairly, of course, meaning not fair at all. Every peasant owed at least 3 kinds of dues: rent for the land itself, tithe for the church, and labor. Because even after handing over your food, you were expected to help build the Lord's new barn to store his portion. If that sounds exhausting, that's because it was. But the tithes were the most interesting. The church had this way of turning grain into morality. Give generously, and your soul was lighter. Hold back, and you might end up on the priest's problem list, which was bad, especially if you wanted your family buried in the churchyard instead of somewhere near the compost heap. So people gave, sometimes joyfully, sometimes grudgingly, always nervously. Now, tithes weren't just symbolic, they were serious business. Every diocese had granaries, tithe barns, where the clergy stored their share. These barns were massive, carefully built, and often better maintained than the peasants' own homes. Picture this: you're a farmer who spent all summer bent over in the fields. Your back hurts, your shoes are more patched than leather, and your hands are raw. And then, on a cold autumn morning, you line up at the tithe barn with your cart. The priest's assistant measures your grain with an elegant wooden scoop. He nods solemnly, says something about divine order, and your 10th sack disappears through the big oak doors. You go home lighter. The priest goes home smugger. But of course, not everyone played by the rules. Hidden granaries were a thing, makeshift storage pits behind barns. sealed and camouflaged under straw. A small act of rebellion. People told themselves it wasn't theft, just protecting what God already gave them. Sometimes the clergy caught on. There are records from the 13th century of church investigators literally poking the ground with iron rods, listening for the hollow sound of a buried granary. It's kind of funny, in a bleak way, priests out in the mud, stabbing the earth like they're looking for buried treasure, except it's just oats. And then there were the famines. Grain taxes didn't stop just because crops failed. If anything, they became stricter. Lords still wanted their share, even if the fields were dust. The poor were expected to trust in Providence. Providence, as usual, didn't deliver much. When grain ran short, barns turned into symbols of guilt and desperation. You could walk through a village and feel the tension. Who had full stores? Who didn't? Who was secretly hoarding grain while others starved? There were laws about this. Anti-hoarding statutes meant to stop the rich from cornering the market. But enforcement was ... flexible. The bigger your title, the less likely anyone accused you of greed. And so, famines rolled in, quiet, relentless, and cruelly democratic. The Great Famine of 1315 was the worst of them all. Heavy rains ruined crops across northern Europe. Grain rotted in the fields, and barns flooded. Even the rats gave up. Prices skyrocketed. People ate acorns, dogs. Sometimes, even the seed grain meant for next year's planting. Chroniclers at the time wrote with grim understatement. Many were reduced to consuming things unfit for men, which was medieval code for, we don't want to say what really happened. The barns that had once symbolized abundance now became vaults of despair, guarded by armed men, surrounded by hungry neighbors. Priests held processions, begging God to stop the rain. He didn't. The famine lasted nearly 3 years. And when it finally ended, people had learned a bitter truth. Storing grain was easy. Keeping it from the desperate was not. After the famine, superstition got louder. People started believing certain saints had control over the harvest, like Saint Medard in France or Saint Swithin in England. Their feast days were basically medieval weather forecasts. If it rains on Saint Swithin's day, it will rain for 40 more. Spoiler, sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. But people believed it anyway. They'd also sprinkle holy water over the grain, hang charms in barns, and say small prayers every time they opened the doors. Not because it always worked, but because doing something felt better than doing nothing. And then there were curses, the opposite of blessings. If someone stole from your barn, you could go to the local priest and ask him to bind the thief with words. Basically a medieval hex with paperwork. A classic one went, "May the rats find his grain, and the Lord forget his name," which sounds poetic until you realize people genuinely meant it. Let's float for a bit over to the merchant class. Those middlemen who lived off grain trade. By the late Middle Ages, grain wasn't just taxed and blessed, it was also speculated on. Yes, medieval futures markets. Not quite the stock exchange, but close enough. Merchants bought up grain when it was cheap after harvest and hoarded it in warehouses, waiting for winter when prices rose. Then they sold it back at a tidy profit. Everyone hated them, of course, but also needed them. When famines came, these merchants were the villains. But when crops were good, they were saviors. It's a role modern capitalism would eventually perfect: blame when things go bad, applause when they don't. Now, One of the weirdest things about medieval grain culture was the amount of paperwork involved. Even small estates had ledgers, written in cramped Latin, tracking every sack of wheat. Stewards took pride in their neat columns, dates, weights, values. They weren't thinking about history, but those dusty books became some of the best records we have of medieval life. You can literally trace the rhythm of an entire village, the ups and downs of harvests, the years of scarcity, the seasons of plenty, all through grain entries. It's strangely beautiful in a mundane way, the heartbeat of a civilization written in barley and ink. Let's drift to a small village again. It's winter, snow outside. Inside the barn, you can see your breath. A family opens their last barrel of rye. The father measures out a scoop. The mother bakes a small loaf. The children stare at it like it's gold. They eat quietly, not because it's solemn, but because hunger makes silence easier. Outside, the church bell rings. Tomorrow is Lent, a reminder that fasting is holy, though for most people, it's just another word for we're out of food. And still, they survive. Because somehow, against all odds, there's always just enough. By spring, the barns are nearly empty. But that's how it's supposed to be. The cycle restarts. Seed grain goes into the earth, and everyone holds their breath again. The rains might come, or they might not. The rats might stay away, or they might not. But hope, quiet, exhausted, almost shy, keeps people moving. Because they've seen enough winters to know that despair doesn't plant anything, so picture a damp English morning in the 13th century. The mist hangs low over the fields, and somewhere a bell rings for prime, the early morning prayer. Monks shuffle out of their dormitory, sleepy-eyed, clutching cloaks against the cold. Their first stop, the granary. Because before you can pray or preach or copy out the Psalms, you have to make sure your grain hasn't been eaten alive overnight. See, in most monasteries, the granary wasn't just a building. It was a symbol of survival. The monks depended on stored grain not only to make bread, but to barter, pay rents, and feed the poor who lined up at their gates. So, naturally, they kept obsessive records of every sack, every measure, every mouse dropping. Let's talk about those mice for a moment. Medieval grain storage was basically an open buffet for rodents. Stone walls, climbable, wooden doors, chewable sacks. Optional. You might think cats would fix the problem, and yes, there were cats. But they were, let's say, part-time employees. Cats in monasteries had about the same attention span as modern freelancers. They'd chase one mouse, take a nap in a sunbeam, and then stare at the wall for an hour. To combat the mouse problem, monks tried all sorts of low-tech solutions. They hung grain sacks from beams, raised the floors, even sprinkled ash around the storage area to track tiny footprints. But in the end, the mice always won. They had sheer numbers on their side now. Mold was a different story. Mold was what happened when the humidity gods got angry. Medieval England was famously damp, and barns weren't exactly airtight. So when wet grain went into storage, it could heat up, ferment, or turn into something that looked suspiciously like compost. And because they didn't have thermometers, or even much understanding of why fermentation happened, people just shrugged and called it God's will. To prevent this divine disappointment, they developed surprisingly clever methods. They learned to dry the grain in thin layers before storing it, often using raised drying floors made of wicker or perforated tiles. Some monasteries had what we'd now call grain kilners, basically a medieval dehydrator, where they'd warm the grain gently before piling it into bins. Of course, there was always the human factor. Somewhere in every abbey, there was that one monk who took his grain measuring duties a little too seriously. We know this because their account books survive. Page after page of notes about exactly how many bushels were lost to the moisture, or how Brother Walter had once again miscounted the wheat. You can almost hear the passive-aggressive sighs in the margins. And then there were the lay brothers, the working men who did most of the heavy lifting. They carried the grain from the fields, spread it on the drying floors, turned it with shovels, and hauled it into the barns. Imagine doing all that with nothing but a wool tunic and a back that probably ached since age 20. They didn't get much credit, but without them, no monastery would have lasted through a single winter. Speaking of credit, there's something quietly impressive about how organized these storage systems were. We tend to imagine the Middle Ages as chaotic and filthy, and, sure, parts of it were. But when it came to grain, people were meticulous. They had to be. Starvation wasn't theoretical. It was an annual possibility. So the granary was treated like a treasury, literally, in fact. The Latin word for granary, granarium, was often used metaphorically in sermons to describe the soul. Keep your grain clean and safe, they'd say, as you keep your soul free from sin. It's kind of poetic. If you ignore the fact that mold and sin had roughly the same level of inevitability, let's float over to another detail: theft. Because yes, medieval people stole grain all the time. Sometimes out of desperation, sometimes out of sheer opportunity. A missing sack here, a miscounted measure there, it added up. And when famine years hit, even the most pious monk might quietly help himself to a little extra bread dough at night. To prevent this, monasteries started locking their barns with iron fittings. Keys were kept by the cellarer, the monk in charge of provisions. He was basically the medieval equivalent of a supply chain manager. Except instead of spreadsheets, he had parchment rolls and prayers. If anything went missing, he'd get an earful from the abbot. You could say it was a high-stress job, especially when your inventory could literally sprout legs and run away. Meanwhile, out in the countryside, peasants had their own smaller barns. Nothing fancy, just timber frames with wattle and daub walls. But they used the same logic: raise the grain off the ground, keep it dry, and pray it lasts the winter. Sometimes they'd even bury backup grain in sealed clay pots underground, just in case things went badly. Think of it as the medieval version of an emergency savings account, except filled with oats instead of cash. What's interesting is how social grain storage was. A poor harvest didn't just mean hunger, it meant tension. Villagers might start accusing each other of hoarding or cheating on tithes. Priests would preach about generosity while quietly measuring their own supply behind locked doors. It wasn't exactly community spirit at its best. And through it all, the barns stood quietly at the edge of towns, huge. Solemn structures filled with the hum of insects and the soft sigh of settling straw. You can almost hear it, can't you? The creak of beams, the soft rustle as a mouse scurries somewhere in the dark. For the people who lived then, that sound was the heartbeat of survival, anyway. Before we drift too far into medieval ASMR, let's move gently into the next stretch of our story, where grain stops being just food and starts being power. Because, in the Middle Ages, whoever controlled the barns controlled the people. And nothing says authority like a few thousand bushels of wheat locked behind a heavy oak door. Let's ease into that, shall we? If you were a medieval peasant, your relationship with grain was intimate, exhausting, and occasionally tragic. You planted it, you prayed over it, and when harvest came, you begged the weather to stay kind for just a few more days. Every stalk cut was a tiny victory. Every handful that made it to the barn was a sigh of relief. But of course, even when the grain was safely tucked away, there was no peace. Because once you had it, everyone else wanted a piece of it too. The Lord took his share. The church took its tithe. The miller charged his fee. By the time the peasant family sat down with their coarse loaf of bread, they were lucky if they still had enough to last through Lent. And yet, barns, these plain, earthy buildings, were full of small dramas. Not the kind you'd find in palaces or on battlefields, but quiet, local ones. There were disputes over missing sheaves, over whether the tithe had been properly weighed, over who left the granary door open in the rain. Imagine the arguments. You said you'd close it. No, you said you would. God help us all, the rye soaked. It sounds mundane, but this was the stuff life depended on. Let's wander over to another kind of barn, the tithe barn. These were enormous, almost cathedral-like structures built by the church to collect its share of the harvest. Some still stand today, all high ceilings and elegant timber frames, big enough to fit entire villages inside. The scale of them says everything about medieval priorities. God needed space, and lots of it, for his grain. The tithe barn was where farmers brought 1/10 of everything they grew. Wheat, barley, peas, even hay. They'd pile it up in neat stacks, watched over by a priest or a monk who would nod solemnly and take notes. Sometimes people grumbled about unfair weights or corrupt officials. But complaining too loudly about the church's grain wasn't a great career move. The barn itself had a smell, earthy, sweet, a mix of straw and dust and faint rot. Light filtered in through narrow slits, catching the drifting particles like glitter in the air. And somewhere in the rafters, pigeons cooed softly, dropping a steady rain of feathers and other less charming gifts onto the stored grain. Because nothing in medieval life was ever entirely clean now. Let's talk about something oddly fascinating: grain measurement. In theory, every region had standard units: the bushel, the peck, the quarter. In practice, it was chaos. A bushel in one county could be a completely different size in another. This was great for cheating. A lord collecting rent in grain might use an oversized measure when taking and a smaller one when giving. And, of course, he'd call it tradition. That kind of inconsistency led to endless arguments. There were even royal decrees trying to standardize weights and measures. But enforcing them across 1,000 muddy villages wasn't exactly easy. So people improvised, and the barn became a quiet battleground of scoops and scales. Then there was... Every medieval account book has some sad little entry about grain lost to damp or consumed by vermin. When that happened, it wasn't just an inconvenience, it could trigger famine. Whole communities might starve because a few weeks of wet weather ruined the crop in bad years. Barns became symbols of tension and despair. Imagine the village in late winter, snow melting into mud, everyone hungry. The barn door stays locked, guarded by the steward. People whisper that the Lord is hoarding grain, waiting to sell it at a higher price. The air feels heavy. This isn't a Hollywood uprising, it's quieter, sadder. Just people slowly losing patience with hunger and powerlessness. And yet, medieval life went on. The next spring, the fields were plowed again. Seeds were scattered. And everyone hoped that this year, maybe, they'd fill the barn enough to make it through. That endless cycle of planting, Storing and surviving defined their world. What's strange is how spiritual it all was. Monks wrote prayers specifically for grain storage. They blessed the barns. Some even sprinkled holy water on the harvest. They believed rot and pests weren't just natural problems, they were moral ones, signs of sin or neglect. So keeping the barn clean wasn't just practical, it was holy. And speaking of holy, monks sometimes got creative about protecting their stores. Some hung carved crosses above the barn doors. Others painted saints on the walls. Saint Blaise was a popular choice, since he was the patron of both animals and, somewhat inexplicably, throats. Maybe they figured he'd keep everyone and everything from choking. A few monasteries even claimed relics could protect the harvest. There's a 14th century account of one abbey that stored a fragment of a saint's bone in their granary, believing it kept mold away. Did it work? Probably not. But it did give them a good story for the pilgrims. It's easy to smile at this, but it's also kind of moving. These people lived in constant uncertainty. They didn't control the weather or the pests, or even their own fates most of the time. So they clung to rituals, to crosses, to relics, to the simple act of sweeping the barn floor and whispering a prayer that the grain would hold out until Easter now. As we start to drift toward the later Middle Ages, things begin to shift. Grain storage becomes less local and more centralized. Lords start selling surplus grain to towns. Monasteries run large-scale granaries as businesses. And with that, barns turn from humble necessities into signs of wealth. The bigger your barn, the more powerful you looked. Some were enormous, 30, 40 meters long, built like fortresses, with massive doors and high-pitched roofs. You could walk inside and feel tiny beneath the beams. They were practical, yes, but also theatrical. The architecture itself said, "I own this land. I feed this region. You depend on me." So by the 14th century, grain barns were as much about prestige as preservation. A lord might show off his new granary the way a modern millionaire shows off a yacht. It was status storage. And yet, despite the grandeur, the same small, dusty problems persisted. Mice still nibbled. Mold still crept. A careless servant still forgot to close a shutter, and the rain still came in. The barns got bigger, the woodwork more elaborate, but the daily rhythm, the slow, tedious business of keeping food alive, never changed. Let's pause there for a second. Take a breath. Imagine that quiet again. The hush inside a medieval barn, the smell of old grain, the soft crackle of straw underfoot. Outside, maybe you hear a church bell, maybe a rooster. It's calm, ordinary, and strangely peaceful. You've officially outlasted half the monks of Europe, so congratulations. Tonight, we're leaving behind the quiet smell of straw and stepping into something heavier, the politics of grain. Or, to put it more bluntly, how barns quietly ran the world. Because once you start looking at medieval society through the lens of food, everything suddenly makes sense. Kings ruled, sure. Priests preached. But the people who actually controlled the grain, the stewards, abbots, and landlords, controlled everything else. Let's start with something simple. A barn was basically a vault. Not for gold, but for something even more valuable, calories. A barn full of wheat could feed hundreds, keep armies marching, or make a lord rich through trade. A barn half empty meant riots, famine, and disease. So, whoever had the keys to the barn had leverage, and nobody understood this better than medieval monarchs. Take Edward III of England, for instance. The man loved war, specifically, very expensive war. But wars need soldiers, and soldiers need bread. So, in the 14th century, the crown began quietly taking loans of grain from towns and abbeys to fund campaigns in France. Those loans, by the way, were rarely repaid. Because what's the point of being king if you can't borrow indefinitely and then forget about it? Abbeys were some of the biggest players in this grain economy. They didn't just store food for survival, they speculated. Monks kept records of market prices, traded with merchants, and sold surplus grain for profit. There's even evidence of monasteries forming little trade networks, shipping their grain to ports like Bristol or Rouen. Imagine monks in long robes, arguing with ship captains about freight rates. It's not the image you get from stained glass windows, but it happened. And of course, every time the price of bread went up, people blamed someone, usually the wrong someone. Let's float over to France for a moment. Always a good idea when you want a little more drama. In the 13th and 14th centuries, French kings tried to regulate grain prices to prevent famine riots. It never worked. Merchants hoarded grain to sell it later at higher prices, and officials pretended not to notice as long as they got their cut. When famine hit, everyone suddenly became very pious and blamed the weather. But sometimes, the weather wasn't the real culprit. Sometimes, barns themselves became tools of control. Lords would literally lock up food to keep peasants dependent. There are records from northern Italy where landowners refused to sell grain locally, preferring to export it to cities for higher profits, even while villagers starved nearby. It's not exactly the chivalric ideal, but it was the economic reality. And then there were the taxes. Oh, the taxes. Medieval governments loved taxing grain. They taxed it when it was harvested, when it was stored, when it was milled, when it was baked. The barn was like a toll booth for existence. If you grew food, you paid. If you didn't grow food, you paid more. In towns, things got even more complicated. Urban granaries, sometimes owned by the city, sometimes by guilds, acted like banks. People could deposit grain and withdraw it later, paying small storage fees. These municipal barns were supposed to protect citizens from famine. Sometimes they did. Other times, corrupt officials quietly sold off the grain and pocketed the profit. Bureaucracy, it turns out, was not invented in modern times. One of the most interesting examples comes from Florence in the 14th century. The city had what was called the Ufficio del Grano, literally the grain office. It kept track of every sack entering or leaving the city. Clerks wrote endless lists on parchment, tallying who owed what. The goal was noble: keep bread prices stable, avoid panic. The result? Arguments, shortages, and a growing black market in smuggled wheat. You might be thinking, that sounds miserable, and yes, it kind of was. But there was also a strange order to it. People understood that grain was life, and that meant it was worth fighting over, but in slow, bureaucratic ways. Petitions, fines, letters to the king. It wasn't always torches and pitchforks. Often it was ink and stamps. Still, when things got bad enough, barns burned. There are recorded incidents: England in 1315, Flanders in 1379, where starving peasants raided granaries. They weren't looters in the modern sense. They just wanted food that technically belonged to them before taxes took it. But history, of course, writes them down as rioters. And yet, it's hard not to sympathize. Imagine working all year to fill someone else's barn, knowing that if the harvest failed, you'd be the one to go hungry. It was a cruel system, wrapped in piety and tradition, and every sack of grain stacked neatly under a beam represented that quiet, grinding inequality. But let's step away from the politics for a moment and look at how grain storage shaped the architecture of power. Big barns weren't just useful, they were impressive. Their size, their craftsmanship, their sheer presence said, "We can survive the winter, and you can't." Lords built barns with high stone walls and carved doorways. Some even had decorative carvings, coats of arms, biblical scenes, little reminders of divine order. Others were fortified, because yes, sometimes people really did try to storm them. A few had watchtowers or arrow slits. When you start needing defensive structures for your food, it's probably a sign of social tension. Meanwhile, peasants' barns were shrinking. The more control lords and monasteries took, the less grain ordinary people got to store themselves. The image of the self-sufficient farmer began to fade. Instead, peasants became laborers on someone else's land, watching the harvest carted away to barns they'd never enter. Let's pause for a second. There's something haunting about that, isn't there? These barns, massive, silent, full of abundance, while outside, people scraped together barley flour and weeds just to make bread. The contrast is almost cinematic. But for medieval people, it wasn't a scene. It was Tuesday still. Not everything was bleak. Grain also connected people. Fairs and markets brought farmers, millers, and merchants together. They traded gossip, recipes, and marriage prospects alongside sacks of wheat. Even the church got involved, organizing charitable grain distributions during lean years. It wasn't much, but it was something. There's one story from France that always sticks with me. In 1374, during a famine, a Benedictine abbot opened his monastery's granary and gave out bread until nothing was left. The records note, somewhat dryly, that the abbot died soon after. From exhaustion and sorrow, it's both touching and grim. One man's compassion against an entire system built on scarcity by now. You can probably see how something as boring as a barn could sit at the heart of everything: economy, religion, politics, even morality. It's not glamorous, but it's real. Kings could claim divine right, nobles could boast of lineage, but in the end, everyone bowed to the same truth: no grain, no life. So the next time you picture medieval history, don't just imagine castles and crusades. Picture barns, long, dark, solemn barns, full of whispers and grain dust, holding the fate of kingdoms between their beams. Let's linger a bit longer in the slow, creaking world of medieval barns, where grain wasn't just stored, it was wielded. Because by the 14th and 15th centuries, controlling grain wasn't merely about survival or taxation. It was a form of political power, subtle and sometimes ruthless. Picture a lord surveying his lands. He didn't just look at fields. He looked at barns. How full are they? How well are they guarded? How likely are the peasants to revolt if he suddenly decides, for reasons only he understands, that he's going to withhold some grain this year? A full granary could mean obedience. An empty one could mean rebellion. During famine years, some lords deliberately withheld grain to raise prices. They called it market management, but the peasants called it cruel. Imagine trudging through snow to the local market, seeing carts piled high with wheat that you can't afford. That barn of plenty is just a taunt. And it works, The people become dependent on the same man who starved them last winter. Power wrapped in starch and husks. And this wasn't limited to local lords. Kings did it too. Edward III of England, as I mentioned, was fond of borrowing grain from towns and monasteries to fund his campaigns. But sometimes he didn't return it, or returned it in smaller amounts than promised. This created a delicate balance. Towns needed the crown for protection, but despised its interference in their food supply. On the continent, in France and Italy, it got more complicated. Merchants, monasteries, and guilds all had a hand in controlling grain. When famine hit, city councils tried to regulate prices, but the wealthy traders often ignored regulations, selling grain at whatever price the market would bear. Granaries became battlegrounds, not with swords, but with legal codes, bribes, and secret contracts. Sometimes the crown got creative. In 14th century Florence, authorities would force merchants to sell at fixed prices under threat of punishment. Occasionally, they'd confiscate grain outright and redistribute it to the poor. The idea sounds noble, but it led to smuggling, falsified weights, and, inevitably, corruption. The more control the government tried to exert, the more cunning people became. A classic medieval dance. Regulation versus human ingenuity. Meanwhile, famine and grain shortages weren't just economic. They were moral and social crises. People whispered that hoarders were cursed. Priests preached that those who withheld food from the needy would face divine wrath. Sometimes, these sermons were taken seriously enough to inspire riots. Other times, they were purely rhetorical. Either way, barns and their contents were now not just practical, they were symbolic. Let's also touch on war. Grain could be weaponized. During conflicts, armies often targeted granaries first. Destroying a barn didn't just reduce supplies, it broke morale. A full barn was a shield, an empty one a dagger. There are records from the 100 Years' War where entire villages were starved out. Their granaries burned, leaving nothing for months. Subtle, slow-moving terror, but terror nonetheless. Yet, amid all this, some ingenuity thrived. Monasteries in particular developed systems to protect their stores. Elevated floors, double walls, ventilation shafts, and even early pest-proofing techniques. Some barns were designed like fortresses, not because of marauders with swords, but because of humans with clever ideas, and mice, always mice, and while lords and kings schemed with grain, the ordinary people adapted. They learned to bury small caches, preserve seeds in clay jars, and barter secretly. Even in the harshest winters, someone somewhere kept a few handfuls tucked away. It wasn't wealth, it was survival. And survival in the medieval world often depended on knowing where the grain was, who controlled it, and how much could be sneaked past the watchful eyes of stewards and monks. By the late 15th century, the landscape had shifted further. Trade routes had expanded. Grain moved not just from field to barn, but from country to country. Italian merchants brought wheat from the south to northern markets. Hanseatic League ships carried barley across the Baltic. Granaries were no longer purely local. They were nodes in a vast, interconnected network. And with that network came new challenges: spoilage, theft, disputes over transport, and fluctuating prices across borders. But through it all, barns remained the quiet constants. Their massive beams, carefully thatched roofs, and silent interiors were the backbone of civilization. They were where wealth, survival, and power met. and often collided. You could see a barn as just a storage space, or you could see it as a lens through which to understand medieval life. Slow, meticulous, precarious, and full of small human dramas. One of the key players here were guilds. Grain merchants weren't wandering villages with wheelbarrows. They were organized, and they liked rules. The bakers' guilds, the millers' guilds, even the merchants' guilds set strict standards. How grain should be stored, measured, and sold. Not out of kindness, but because control over quality and quantity meant control over profit. Picture a guild hall, meeting a dozen men in dark woolen coats, quills in hand, arguing over the correct height for stacking sacks or the precise moisture content allowed. One rogue merchant tried to sneak in damp grain from a southern shipment. The others frowned. That could spoil the market, they muttered. And the rogue merchant nodded, taking careful notes, probably thinking about how to cheat just a little next time. Even towns got involved. Urban granaries began to appear in cities across northern Europe. They were called barches in England, magazzini in Italy, Kornhauser in Germany. Names aside, their function was the same. Central storage to stabilize the market, prevent famine, and, if you were clever, collect a little profit along the way. But central storage also meant central vulnerability. If the barn burned, if the clerk fudged the books, if rats found a way in, an entire town could suddenly find itself scrambling for food. And towns weren't shy about blaming someone. Guilds, officials, or even the local abbot could be accused of negligence, or worse, malice. And yes, politics played a quiet but persistent role. A lord could offer access to his granaries in exchange for loyalty, taxes, or military service. A merchant could lend a city grain to curry favor with officials. And if someone had a falling out with the crown, well, let's just say that a conveniently empty barn could be very persuasive. Religious institutions weren't immune either. Some abbeys stored enough surplus to feed entire regions during lean years. Others, trying to assert influence, held grain as leverage over local populations, only releasing it when donations, favors, or political concessions were made. Monks were supposed to be pious, but they were also people who understood the value of food. Then came the small but relentless nuisances: mold, moisture, mice. Even the most secure, well-planned granary was at the mercy of natural decay. Medieval people developed all sorts of clever strategies: elevating floors, building ventilation shafts, covering sacks with straw, even hanging garlic and herbs as mild pest deterrents. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than nothing. And yet, for all the effort, human error remained the most constant threat. Clerks servants misreported, lords misjudged demand. One rainy winter could ruin months of careful planning, and through it all, the cycle continued: plant, harvest, store, protect, pray, and survive. There's a quiet poetry in this. Medieval barns were full of small, human stories, failures, successes, hope, despair, all stacked neatly in sacks of grain. Each barn was a microcosm of society itself, showing the interplay between power, survival, faith, and human nature. So, let's get comfortable. Imagine a village in late 14th century England. The air is cold and damp. The mud is thick enough to pull at boots, and somewhere a bell tolls for matins. You can hear it over the soft rustle of grain in the barn. But this barn, once full of hope and routine, feels quieter than it should. There's tension in the air. People have learned that abundance can vanish faster than expected. First, the climate. The 14th century brought what historians now call the Little Ice Age. Winters were colder, summers were shorter. Rain fell when it shouldn't, and the sun hid behind clouds for weeks. Fields that once produced a reliable harvest now struggled. Grain that survived the cutting and threshing often failed to dry properly, leaving barns damp and vulnerable to rot. For peasants and landlords alike, this was terrifying. You can imagine walking through a barn, lifting a sack of wheat, and feeling the chill of moisture seeping through the straw. One misjudged season, and the harvest could turn to mush. Storage techniques that had worked for decades suddenly became unreliable. And then came famine. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 had already shaken Europe. But waves of scarcity kept rolling in. When grain stores failed, the social order trembled. Peasants might quietly hide small caches in their homes, hoping to survive the lean months. Lords and merchants hoarded whatever they could, sometimes doubling down on control, sometimes losing patience with the very people they relied on to work their fields. Some of the cleverer barns developed new safety measures: raised floors, better ventilation, tighter locks. Others relied on prayer, blessing, and superstition, hanging charms and relics over the stored grain, hoping divine intervention would hold back rot and pests. Neither approach was foolproof. And then, of course, the Black Death arrived. Mid-14th century, 1347 to 1351, Europe lost roughly a third of its population. Farms were abandoned. Fields went until granaries, those huge, solemn barns, stood half empty, sometimes untouched for months, sometimes stripped bare by the few who remained. What's striking is how differently people reacted. Some nobles tried to maintain control, rationing grain to the survivors. Monks in monasteries continued their meticulous records, noting every sack, every loss, every death. But in villages, the social contract frayed. Labor shortages meant fewer hands to harvest and store grain. Surviving peasants suddenly had more bargaining power, but also more responsibility. In some regions, barns became ghostly spaces, empty, silent, filled with dust and memories of those who had died. Rats still scuttled. Mold still crept along the walls. And yet, life slowly returned. Surviving communities reorganized, fields were replanted, and barns once again began to fill. Though never quite in the same way. Another consequence of plague and famine was migration. Survivors moved to towns or richer lands, seeking better opportunities. Grain storage adapted accordingly. Urban granaries became more prominent, and towns started maintaining stockpiles to stabilize prices and prevent riots. Some cities even developed rudimentary insurance systems. If the harvest failed, the communal granary could supply a portion of food funded by taxes and levies. Meanwhile, the monasteries continued to run their granaries with astonishing precision. Despite the upheaval, monks preserved records that modern historians now treasure. They show how people coped, how they measured losses, distributed food, and tried to prevent famine from returning. There's a quiet nobility in those meticulous ledgers, a testament to survival amid chaos. And then, slowly, the economy began to change. Grain moved from being purely local to being part of larger trade networks. Italian merchants, Hanseatic traders, and English exporters all played roles in distributing surplus and stabilizing scarcity. Barns in port towns became storage hubs for trade, not just survival. With that, the meaning of granary shifted from simple storage to economic power. Whoever controlled these hubs wielded influence over entire regions. But even as trade grew, local vulnerability persisted. Weather, war, and disease could still disrupt supply chains. A barn wasn't just a building. It was a fragile node in a precarious system. One mismanaged store, one spoiled sack, one raiding party could cascade into widespread hunger. Amid all this hardship, people still found ways to preserve life, culture, and routine. Festivals marking the harvest continued. Tithes still brought grain to churches, even if the quantities were smaller. Families hoarded what they could, sometimes burying seed grain in clay pots underground, ensuring that life would continue even if storage barns failed. It's fascinating, really, how these structures, simple barns, stood at the center of everything. They were practical, yes, but they were also social, moral, political, and emotional spaces. Each beam, each sack, each dusty corner told a story of care, anxiety, hope, and survival. By the late 14th century, the medieval barn had become more than a building. It was a symbol of stability and instability, of human ingenuity and human fragility, of wealth and dependence, of life itself. And that's the slow, gentle lesson we can take from it. Even the most mundane spaces can reveal the heartbeat of history after the Black Death. The medieval world was quieter in some ways, but more precarious in others. Labor shortages meant fewer hands to harvest fields, thresh grain, and guard granaries. Peasants who survived suddenly had more leverage. Lords had to pay higher wages or offer better conditions, or risk losing workers altogether. This small shift in power rippled through the countryside, affecting how barns were stocked, monitored, and managed. Monasteries, ever meticulous, adapted carefully. They kept detailed inventories, noting not only quantities, but also the quality of grain. Some implemented rotating stock systems, older grain used first, newer grain stored on higher floors to dry better. It's subtle, but it shows that survival after catastrophe required more than sheer luck. It required organization, planning, and a bit of ingenuity. Towns and cities also changed their approach. Urban granaries grew in importance. Local governments began to recognize that controlling stored grain could prevent famine and maintain civil order. Communal barns were carefully monitored, often with officials appointed to oversee deposits and withdrawals. Some cities even experimented with early forms of rationing, distributing grain in measured amounts during hard winters. Trade networks, disrupted by plague and famine, gradually re-established themselves. Italian merchants shipped wheat north. The Hanseatic League moved barley across the Baltic, and English ports sent surplus grain to the continent. Barns in port towns became central nodes in this trade, shifting from purely local survival tools to critical elements of an interconnected economy. And yet, the basic challenges remained: moisture, mold, and mice. Even the most sophisticated urban granaries or fortified monastic stores couldn't entirely prevent spoilage. Drying floors, ventilation shafts, and elevated storage platforms were helpful. But the medieval understanding of biology was limited. Pestilence, decay, and mismanagement continued to threaten the fragile balance of supply and demand. The human factor remained just as important. Clerks could miscount, stewards could mismanage, and lords could make poor decisions in moments of impatience or greed. A single error could cascade into shortages, inflated prices, or unrest. Sometimes, Monasteries or towns would quietly redistribute grain to prevent famine, while quietly noting the losses in their records. This blend of prudence, bureaucracy, and moral concern defined how communities navigated post-plague scarcity. Interestingly, this period also saw the beginnings of more systematic storage techniques. Some wealthy lords and abbeys experimented with multiple storage facilities, spreading grain across different barns to reduce risk. They learned to rotate stock, check for pests regularly, and even isolate damp or damaged grain to prevent contamination of the rest. Even the spiritual side persisted. Blessings of barns, prayers over stored grain, and charms hung above doors remained common. People believed that divine favor could complement careful planning, a recognition that both human diligence and spiritual care were necessary to survive. And yet, the memories of famine and plague lingered. Empty barns were haunting reminders of vulnerability, while full ones were sources of comfort and quiet pride. The rhythm of life, plant, harvest, store, pray, continued. But everyone now knew that abundance was fragile in rural villages. Peasants quietly buried small caches of grain to protect themselves from future shortages. In towns, officials carefully monitored communal barns, knowing that one miscalculation could trigger unrest. And in monasteries, monks meticulously logged every sack, every measure, every loss. Through all this, barns were more than buildings. They were records of survival, tools of governance, and symbols of resilience. As we drift toward the late 15th century, barns would continue to evolve. Storage techniques improved, trade expanded, and society slowly stabilized after decades of climate upheaval, famine, and plague. But the lessons of the 14th century, vulnerability, diligence, and the quiet power of stored grain, would remain embedded in every beam, every sack, and every dusty corner of the medieval granary. By the 16th century, Europe was slowly emerging from the turbulence of famine, plague, and climate instability. Fields recovered, populations rebounded, and communities rebuilt. But the memory of scarcity lingered. Barns were no longer just simple structures of timber and thatch. They became deliberate, sophisticated spaces designed for both efficiency and longevity. Let's begin with architecture. Early modern barns often had larger, more open interiors than their medieval predecessors. Timber framing remained common, but beams were carefully jointed, roofs reinforced, and floors elevated to prevent moisture from creeping in. In some regions, brick or stone foundations were added, especially in wealthier estates, providing durability against both rot and fire. Ventilation became a science of sorts. Builders realized that airflow could prevent mold and spoilage, so barns were constructed with small gaps in walls, louvered vents, or even clerestory windows to encourage circulation. Grain was piled strategically, often on raised platforms or in bins, to minimize contact with damp floors. The lessons learned from centuries of trial and error were slowly codified into practice. Alongside architectural improvements, new storage tools emerged. Sack storage was still common, but we start to see the use of granaries with multiple compartments, each for a different type of grain or seed. This allowed for rotation, reducing spoilage and contamination. Some barns even used primitive threshing floors inside, so that grain could be partially cleaned and dried immediately before storage. Merchants and towns also refined their practices. Urban granaries expanded, becoming central hubs for trade. Standardized measurements were increasingly enforced, reducing disputes over weights and volumes. The rise of bookkeeping, accounting for every sack and bushel, meant that errors could be traced, losses recorded, and inventories monitored with unprecedented precision. But let's not pretend everything was perfect. Pestilence remained a persistent nuisance. Mice, rats, and insects were constant threats, and damp wood and straw continued to harbor mold. People tried clever solutions, hanging herbs or garlic in granaries, lining floors with sand or ashes, and using raised bins or baskets to protect the most valuable seed grain. Success was never guaranteed, but it was better than leaving everything on the floor and hoping for the best. Weather remained another challenge. Despite milder winters compared to the Little Ice Age, sudden rains or floods could still compromise stored grain. Early modern communities began to take a more proactive approach. Barns were often positioned on high ground, drainage ditches dug around foundations, and tarps or removable covers employed to protect vulnerable sacks. One of the most interesting developments was the increasing economic and social role of barns. Beyond survival, grain storage became deeply tied to commerce, taxation, and political influence. Nobles could loan surplus grain to towns, earning fees or loyalty in return. Merchants could speculate, storing grain to sell when prices rose. Even governments recognized that barns were tools of policy. A well-stocked granary could stabilize a city, while an empty one could induce compliance or panic. Monasteries, ever meticulous, continued to refine their systems. Abbot-led inventories detailed the amount, quality, and intended use of every sack. Grain set aside for trade, charity, or seed was carefully separated. Some monasteries even employed apprentices to monitor storage conditions, ensuring that nothing was lost to spoilage or theft. The principle was simple: human diligence, when combined with observation and organization, could maximize survival and sometimes profit. Yet, the cultural and symbolic aspects of barns persisted. They were still seen as markers of wealth, stability, and authority. A massive, well-maintained barn signaled not just abundance, but competence. Smaller barns indicated vulnerability. Communities recognized that the presence of a sturdy granary was a reassurance. It meant someone had planned, someone had cared, and life could continue despite the uncertainties of climate, labor, and disease. Interestingly, this period also saw a subtle shift in public perception. Whereas medieval barns were often sacred or morally loaded, blessed by priests, symbolizing piety, the early modern barn became more pragmatic. Faith remained, of course, but the emphasis shifted toward efficiency, management, and economic foresight. The barn was now a tool, not just a symbol. And yet, the human stories continued, quietly unfolding in the shadows. Clerks argued over counts. Apprentices misreported damaged sacks. Servants accidentally let doors swing open in the rain. There were still mice, still mold, still the ever-present worry of spoilage. But amid all this, communities had learned resilience. They had learned to anticipate scarcity, to distribute grain judiciously, and to adapt structures to meet the demands of a changing world. By the end of the 16th century, barns, once humble, sometimes precarious shelters for grain, had evolved into highly managed spaces. They combined architecture, engineering, bookkeeping, and social organization into a single function, preserving life through stored food. And though the work remained quiet, dusty, and monotonous, it was vital. Every creak of timber, every rustle of straw, every meticulous ledger told the story of people grappling with uncertainty, preparing for the worst. and quietly shaping their societies around a simple human need: sustenance in rural estates. The barn often defined the rhythm of life. The size of a barn communicated status. A lord with a massive timber-framed granary signaled wealth, competence, and the ability to protect his people through lean seasons. Smaller barns, by contrast, hinted at vulnerability or poor management. Villagers watched these structures closely, learning lessons about security, hierarchy, and stewardship just by observing who could store more grain and how well they maintained it. Inside, the barn was a microcosm of the estate's labor system. Peasants, servants, and apprentices worked to keep grain in check, stacking sacks, monitoring moisture, sweeping floors, and occasionally fending off rodents. Records were kept meticulously. Clerks tallied every bushel, noting condition, origin, and intended use. In monasteries, these records became near scientific, showing rotation systems, spoilage rates, and predictions for the next planting season. It was laborious, repetitive, and essential work, quietly heroic in its persistence. Meanwhile, towns had begun standardizing grain storage on a larger scale. Communal granaries were often centrally located, sometimes fortified, and managed by civic officials or guilds. Rules were strict: deposits, withdrawals, measurements, and quality standards were regulated, and mismanagement could carry fines or social disgrace. These barns weren't glamorous, but they became integral to maintaining urban stability. A well-run granary prevented famine panic, stabilized bread prices, and allowed a city to survive bad harvests elsewhere. Trade also reshaped barns in this period. Ports in northern Europe, from Hamburg to Bristol, became hubs for grain distribution. Ships brought wheat, rye, and barley from distant regions, and warehouses, or large port barns, stored it until local markets needed it. Merchants became specialists in logistics and risk management, monitoring every crate for spoilage or theft. Granaries were no longer just about survival. They were instruments of commerce, essential for the growing urban economies. Technology and organization improved as well. Farmers learned to dry grain more efficiently, build elevated storage bins, and use multiple compartments to segregate seed from surplus. Moisture control became a subtle art. Airflow, insulation, and floor construction all mattered. Pest management evolved, too. Some barns used netting, traps, or deterrent plants, while others relied on sheer vigilance. It wasn't foolproof, but over time, these innovations reduced losses and increased the predictability of stored food. Despite all these improvements, barns remained vulnerable. War, theft, and poor management could still devastate supplies. And yet, the stakes were more than practical, they were symbolic. A full barn represented security, careful planning, and the ability to weather. An empty barn signaled weakness, mismanagement, or impending disaster. In a way, barns were the quiet conscience of a community, reflecting the health, foresight, and ethics of those who maintained them. The spiritual and moral dimensions persisted. Many communities continued to bless their barns, sprinkle holy water over stored grain, or hang charms to ward off decay and pests. Even in the early modern period, people believed that diligence alone wasn't enough. Divine favor remained a useful supplement. Monks and parish priests sometimes monitored grain personally, offering prayers for protection, guidance, and plenty. The act of storage was practical, but it was also ritualized, a gentle reminder of the intertwined nature of faith, labor, and survival. By now, the barn had become more than a building. It was a nexus of economy, society, and culture. Its beams and floors told the story of human adaptation, ingenuity, and quiet persistence. It documented the rhythms of work, the anxieties of scarcity, and the slow, deliberate accumulation of knowledge about storage, measurement, and preservation. By the 17th century, barns had evolved into carefully engineered spaces. Timber framing remained common, but joinery was precise. Walls were often reinforced, and roofs were designed to shed rain efficiently. Floors were raised on stone or brick foundations, reducing dampness and minimizing rot. Ventilation became a central concern. Louvered windows, clear story openings, and even small gaps in walls allowed air to circulate, keeping grain dry and reducing mold. Inside, organization was methodical. Grain was stored in segregated compartments, with seed wheat kept separate from surplus for trade or consumption. Rotation systems were used to ensure older grain was used first. Clerks maintained detailed inventories, quantities, condition, origin, and intended use. Every sack of wheat, barley, or rye was noted, measured, and accounted for, a quiet obsession with order born from centuries of lessons about scarcity, spoilage, and survival. Trade now played a central role in shaping barns. Ports like Amsterdam, Hamburg, and Bristol became hubs for grain distribution. Ships arrived with wheat from distant regions, barley from the north, and rye from Central Europe. These cargoes were stored in large warehouses, essentially massive urban granaries, before being sold or redistributed. Merchants specialized in logistics, risk management, and market timing. A well-stocked granary could control prices, stabilize a city, or enrich a merchant beyond imagination. And yet, for all the technical sophistication, barns remained vulnerable. Moisture, pests, and human error were persistent threats. Rats and mice were an ever-present nuisance. Damp floors could ruin months of careful labor. Clerks could miscount or misreport. War and civil unrest added another layer of risk. A well-defended barn could mitigate some threats, but none were entirely immune. Beyond the practical, barns held immense symbolic power. A large, orderly barn represented foresight, wealth, and stability. Smaller barns suggested vulnerability or mismanagement. For towns, the presence of communal granaries, carefully managed, regulated, and audited, was a reassurance, a stabilizing force in unpredictable times. In villages, the size and condition of the Lord's barn silently communicated his competence and reliability. Communities read these structures like books. Every beam, every gap, every sack of grain told a story. Monasteries continued to maintain high standards. Abbots oversaw inventories with meticulous care, monitoring spoilage and ensuring seed grain was preserved. Some monasteries even employed apprentices to observe storage conditions and learn the delicate balance of preservation. The act of storing grain was not merely economic. It was educational, moral, and ritualized. Blessings, prayers, and charms persisted alongside careful stacking. Ventilation and monitoring. Technological improvements began to emerge alongside social innovations. Some barns incorporated multiple floors, with gravity-assisted movement of grain between levels. Others used bins and chutes to facilitate handling and cleaning. Early devices for measuring grain accurately were employed, reducing disputes over quantity and quality. In towns, guilds enforced standards for measurement and storage, ensuring fair trade and minimizing losses. Interestingly, these developments created subtle social hierarchies. Clerks who understood measurement and storage gained influence. Merchants who controlled access to warehouses could shape prices. Monks who maintained meticulous records wielded quiet power over local survival. Barns became centers not just of sustenance but of authority, a reminder that control over food equaled influence in society. And yet, life inside and around the barn remained quiet, slow, and contemplative. Dust motes drifted in shafts of sunlight, rodents scuttled among the corners, and the smell of straw and grain pervaded the space. People worked methodically, stacking sacks, sweeping floors, checking moisture, noting quantities. It was repetitive, tedious work, but absolutely central to survival. The rhythm of life revolved around these structures: plant, harvest, store, monitor, repeat. By the end of the 17th century, barns had achieved a balance between architecture, organization, and social function. They were no longer simple shelters. They were hubs of community life, instruments of commerce, and symbols of resilience. Every creak of timber, every rustle of straw, and every meticulous ledger told the story of human ingenuity in the face of scarcity. By the late 17th century, barns were more than practical buildings. They had become social and economic anchors in their communities. Their size, condition, and organization conveyed information about power, wealth, and foresight without a single word spoken. In rural estates, the barn's role was peasants and servants worked within its walls, stacking sacks, sweeping straw, and monitoring moisture. Clerks kept detailed inventories of each sack of wheat, barley, or rye, noting condition and origin. Every action inside a barn had consequences. A single miscount could result in shortages, disputes, or even social unrest. This quiet, methodical labor was central to the survival of estates and communities alike. Communal barns in towns became even more important. Civic authorities, often in coordination with guilds, regulated storage and distribution to prevent famine and price fluctuations. Rules were strict. Deposits and withdrawals were recorded, quality standards enforced, and violations penalized. These granaries were not glamorous, but they were vital, stabilizing urban life in ways that were subtle yet profoundly influential. Trade continued to shape barns in new ways. Urban warehouses stored grain imported from distant regions, integrating local supply with international markets. Merchants monitored shipments carefully, sometimes speculating on prices or hoarding supplies to influence local economies. Large granaries were now tools of power. Whoever controlled them could indirectly control bread prices, ensure survival, or influence political decisions. The simple act of storing grain had become an exercise in economic strategy, even as architecture and trade advanced. Barns were still vulnerable to the same age-old threats: moisture, pests, and human error. Rodents and insects remained constant adversaries, while damp floors and mismanaged ventilation could ruin months of labor. Clerks occasionally miscounted, apprentices sometimes mismanaged, and storms could compromise the carefully engineered structures. Yet, the human capacity for careful observation and adaptation allowed barns to function effectively. Often, in spite of these vulnerabilities, monastic granaries continued to serve as exemplars of organization. Abbots oversaw inventories with near-scientific precision, ensuring that seed grain was preserved and surplus carefully allocated. Apprentices learned the intricacies of storage, pest control, and accounting, skills that would be passed down to the next generation. blessings and prayers persisted alongside practical measures, reflecting the enduring intertwining of faith and daily labor. Barns also carried symbolic weight. A well-maintained, fully stocked barn communicated security, competence, and authority. An empty or poorly managed barn signaled misfortune, negligence, or vulnerability. Observing these structures, people could read the social and economic health of an estate or town. Communities internalized these lessons quietly. Abundance demanded diligence. Scarcity bred innovation, and stability was always provisional by now. Barns were carefully calibrated systems, combining architecture, technology, social hierarchy, and economic strategy. They embodied centuries of accumulated knowledge, demonstrating how slow, persistent care could mitigate risk, sustain life, and even confer subtle power. Every beam, floorboard, and stack of grain told a story of human resilience, adaptation, and quiet authority. New crops, expanding trade, and shifting social structures transformed these humble structures, though their essential role, preserving life, remained unchanged by the late 17th century. Europe was increasingly connected through trade. Barley, wheat, rye, oats, and corn moved between regions and continents. Granaries in port towns became central hubs for this movement. Ships brought grains from the Americas, rye from the Baltics, and wheat from Italy and southern France. Large warehouses, sometimes several stories high, were carefully organized to accommodate these imports. Grain was no longer merely local sustenance. It was part of an emerging international economy. This expansion introduced new challenges. Imported grain often carried unfamiliar pests or higher moisture content, requiring careful handling. Barns adapted with better ventilation, segregated compartments, and protective flooring. Clerks meticulously recorded the origin of every sack, anticipating disputes or merchants and town officials treated barns as strategic resources. Control over storage meant influence over trade and local markets. In rural estates, barns also evolved. Farmers experimented with new crops, including potatoes, maize, and other imports, storing them alongside traditional grains. These crops required different storage techniques. Potatoes needed cool, ventilated spaces, maize was prone to spoilage if damp, and rye and wheat had their own quirks. Barns became more compartmentalized, with raised bins, separate floors, and sometimes even rudimentary climate control using airflow and insulation. The social dimension of barns continued as well. A well-managed barn was still a symbol of competence and authority. Lords displayed abundance not just for survival, but to demonstrate social dominance. Villagers silently gauged the estate's stability by observing the condition of the granary. Communal granaries in towns became hubs of civic life. Officials managed deposits, monitored withdrawals, and distributed surplus during shortages, quietly reinforcing social order. Technology improved gradually. Simple innovations like slatted floors, raised bins, and multiple compartments minimized spoilage. Measurement devices became more accurate, reducing disputes over weights and volumes. Rotational storage systems ensured older grain was used first, and seed grain was carefully isolated from trade surpluses. Even in rural estates, careful observation, checking moisture, watching for mold, and monitoring rodent activity remained essential. Trade and barns also intersected with emerging financial practices. Some merchants and cities began using barns as collateral for loans or as part of early insurance arrangements. A well-stocked barn could be leveraged to secure credit, fund trade, expeditions, or stabilize municipal economies. The granary had become not just a storage building, but a node in increasingly complex economic networks. Culturally, barns retained symbolic and moral significance. Blessings, prayers, and charms persisted alongside practical management. Monasteries and religious estates continued to meticulously maintain their barns, teaching apprentices the balance of diligence, observation, and faith. Secular estates, while more focused on economic efficiency, still acknowledged the barn's role as a symbol of security and continuity. Even amid globalization and trade, vulnerability persisted. Weather, spoilage, pests, and human error remained constant threats. Yet barns had become resilient structures, refined over centuries of trial and adaptation. They embodied a quiet, methodical wisdom that careful observation, organization, and foresight could preserve life and maintain stability. So, picture it now, a large timber or brick barn on a European estate, sunlight streaming through louvered windows, dust motes drifting lazily, the scent of straw and grain filling the air. Clerks tally sacks of wheat, barley, rye, and imported maize, noting origin, condition, and intended use. Apprentices move quietly, checking bins and sweeping floors. Outside, villagers glance at the structure, silently assessing stability, wealth, and competence. Life continues, methodical, deliberate, and quietly essential. By the late 18th century, barns were not just storage spaces, they were symbols of human ingenuity, social organization, and economic strategy. They connected local survival to global trade, faith to commerce, and simple labor to subtle power. And amid all the dust, straw, and quiet activity, they continued to tell the slow, enduring story of human life, organized around one of our most basic necessities, grain. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Europe and North America were entering the early phases of industrialization. Population growth, urban expansion, and increased trade put new pressure on storage systems. Traditional timber-framed barns and monastic granaries were no longer sufficient to meet the scale of demand. Urban centers required larger storage facilities, and rural estates had to adapt to feed growing populations and supply markets beyond their immediate vicinity. Architecture evolved in response. Large multi-story warehouses and brick granaries became common in cities. Iron reinforcements appeared alongside timber beams to support greater loads. Floors were carefully leveled and sometimes paved with stone or brick to minimize moisture penetration. Ventilation was refined with the use of louvers, vents, and even early fans powered by water or steam in some cases. The goal was the same as ever: keep grain dry, safe, and organized. But now at a scale unimaginable to a medieval peasant. Mechanization began creeping into barns. Simple innovations like screw conveyors, gravity chutes, and pulleys allowed workers to move heavy sacks more efficiently. Threshing machines and early milling technologies meant that grain could be partially processed on site, reducing labor and spoilage. Storage bins were standardized in size, improving rotation systems and reducing disputes over quantity and quality. Clerks continued their meticulous record-keeping, but now with forms and ledgers that reflected a growing, more complex bureaucracy. Rural barns also adapted, though at a slower pace. Estates with sufficient resources built larger, compartmentalized barns capable of storing multiple types of grain separately: wheat, barley, rye, oats, and the ever-increasing use of potatoes and maize. Rotational storage, ventilation, and rodent control became more sophisticated, and wealthy landowners began employing specialists to oversee grain management. Efficiency, once a byproduct of necessity, was now pursued intentionally as a mark of modernity. Trade networks grew exponentially. Railways, canals, and shipping lines connected regional granaries to national and even international markets. Urban warehouses in London, Hamburg, and Amsterdam became massive, almost industrial in scale, capable of storing hundreds of tons of grain. Merchants, brokers, and city officials monitored these stocks carefully, understanding that control over storage equated to influence over markets, prices, and even politics. Even as technology improved, old vulnerabilities persisted. Moisture, mold, pests, and human error still threatened supplies. Fire became a particularly pressing concern in large urban granaries, leading to innovations in fireproof storage, improved construction materials, and emergency protocols. Disaster planning, once a casual concern, became a formal part of granary management. The social role of barns also shifted. In rural areas, they remained symbols of competence, security, and stewardship. In urban centers, they became economic tools, quietly shaping trade and stabilizing food supplies for rapidly growing populations. Monastic and estate barns, while smaller in scale compared to urban warehouses, retained ritualistic and symbolic significance, blessing grain, teaching apprentices, and demonstrating careful stewardship of resources. Culturally, barns continued to serve as markers of continuity amid change. Despite industrialization, the rhythm of storing, counting, monitoring, and distributing grain persisted. Dust, straw, and the faint scent of grain remained constants. Clerks still scratched ink onto ledgers, workers still swept floors, and apprentices still learned the slow art of observation and care. The work was repetitive, quiet, and, in many ways, timeless. So, picture it, a massive brick granary in a bustling port city. Sunlight filters through ventilated windows, dust motes float in the air, and the faint smell of straw and grain pervades the space. Workers operate pulleys, move sacks along chutes, and check bins. Clerks maintain ledgers meticulously. Outside, rail cars or ships arrive, bringing new supplies for storage or trade. The barn hums with quiet, methodical energy. The same purpose it has served for centuries, now amplified by scale and technology. By the mid-19th century, barns had transformed from simple storage structures into hubs of industrial logistics, connecting local production to global trade networks. They were economic engines, social indicators, and repositories of centuries of knowledge about preservation, labor, and risk management. By the late 1800s, industrialization had fully reshaped Europe and North America. Railroads, steamships, and mechanized farming meant that grain could move faster, farther, and in greater quantities than ever before. Barns and granaries adapted accordingly. Timber was still used, but steel and reinforced concrete began appearing in urban warehouses. Multi-story structures, designed to maximize volume while minimizing spoilage, became common. Some granaries even incorporated early forms of temperature control to combat dampness and mold. Mechanization reached inside the barns as well. Elevators, conveyor belts, and automated chutes allowed grain to move from floor to floor with minimal labor. Machines for cleaning, sorting, and partially processing grain reduced spoilage and increased efficiency. Clerks, while still keeping meticulous ledgers, now worked alongside mechanical systems, ensuring that every ton of wheat, barley, or maize was accounted for. The scale was staggering compared to medieval barns, yet the purpose remained the same: preserve life and stabilize supply. Rural barns evolved too, though more slowly. Estates with resources built larger, more compartmentalized barns with raised floors, improved ventilation, and sometimes separate storage for different crops. Rotational storage systems continued, and the management of pests and moisture became more scientific. Specialists oversaw these operations, blending traditional knowledge with emerging techniques in engineering and biology. Trade networks further expanded the role of granaries. Railways connected inland barns to ports, while steamships linked European warehouses with colonies and the Americas. Urban granaries became central hubs for distribution, and the control of these facilities translated directly into economic power. Merchants, brokers, and government officials monitored stocks, adjusting supply to prevent shortages or price spikes. In essence, barns became critical nodes in industrial economies. Vulnerability, of course, persisted. Moisture, mold, and pests remained concerns, while fire became a major risk in densely packed urban granaries. Advances in construction, fireproof materials, sprinkler systems, and compartmentalization mitigated some of these risks. Disaster planning became formalized, with city authorities and warehouse managers designing protocols to preserve both grain and lives, socially and culturally. Barns retained symbolic significance. A well-maintained, full granary conveyed wealth, foresight, and stability. In rural areas, it reflected careful stewardship. In urban centers, it demonstrated organizational competence and economic influence. Even as industrial techniques replaced manual labor, the quiet, methodical rhythm of storage, inventory, and care persisted. Clerks still scratched ledgers, workers still monitored bins, and the faint smell of grain and straw lingered, connecting the modern era to centuries of human experience. Interestingly, barns also became educational spaces. Agricultural schools and experimental farms used granaries to teach storage techniques, pest control, and the science of moisture management. Apprentices learned to integrate centuries of traditional knowledge with new technologies, ensuring that lessons from medieval barns remained relevant even in industrial contexts. By the early 20th century, the barn had become a hybrid of tradition and modernity, a structure that preserved centuries of accumulated wisdom while embracing mechanization, engineering, and scientific understanding. Its core function, protecting grain, sustaining communities, and stabilizing economies, remained unchanged. So picture it: a massive industrial granary in a city, sunlight slanting through vents, dust motes floating in shafts of air, the faint scent of straw and grain. Conveyor belts hum quietly, elevators move sacks between floors, clerks check ledgers, and workers monitor bins. Outside, trains or ships arrive with new cargo. The barn hums with deliberate, steady motion, an evolution of centuries of slow, careful adaptation, connecting local fields to global trade. Barns, once humble timber structures in medieval villages, now stood as monuments to human ingenuity, perseverance, and the quiet, ongoing struggle to preserve life and resources.